George Orwell was not born to write novels. He was born to understand what others preferred to ignore. In Burma, he saw the naked power of the empire. In the mines of northern England, he knew hunger. In the Spanish Civil War, he discovered that lies could kill more than bullets. When he returned to London, he found something worse than censorship: consensus. People who knew the truth, but decided to remain silent. He saw it in the newspapers, in the newsrooms, in the speeches. And he understood that the 20th century would not be dominated by dictators, but by the collective desire to believe in the most comfortable version of the world. Since then, his works tried to decipher that phenomenon. They did not speak of tyrants, they spoke of ordinary citizens, of entire societies that learn to live within the false until lying becomes easier than seeking the truth. So, could it be that what Orwell warned is already happening again? Homage to Catalonia, the truth was shot. George Orwell arrives in Spain in the last days of 1936. He does not seek fame nor adventure. He comes with a clear idea: to observe for himself a revolution in progress. In his notebook, he notes that Madrid resists and that the Aragon front seems stable. He crosses the border with simple papers, a light suitcase, and the conviction that anti-fascism has practical sense, not just political. What he finds in Barcelona exceeds his expectation: a city where the symbols have changed owners and order seems to have been replaced by an improvised equality. The trams are covered with red and black flags. The waiters address the customer as comrade. On the walls, slogans in favor of the people can be read. Orwell walks along the Ramblas and feels something new: the sensation of being inside a society that is trying to be born from zero. There are no visible classes, uniforms mix, courtesy has become horizontal. That first impact marks him forever. Years later, he will remember it as the moment when he believed it possible that justice was not a word, but a visible behavior. He decides to join the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, not because of closed ideology, but because it was the group that welcomed him first. His destination will be the Aragon front, near Huesca. They send him with a poorly equipped but enthusiastic unit. Winter falls hard and the trench is a line of mud and wire. There he discovers that real war is less heroic than what the newspapers say. The men sleep with their boots on, the cold cuts the skin, and food arrives with luck once a day. However, no one complains. What sustains the battalion is the belief that they are fighting for something worthwhile: a life without masters. In that context, during the long nights of guard duty, he writes in his notebook. He records names, dates, small episodes: a comrade wounded by a stray bullet, a dead mule in the middle of the road, a conversation about the future after victory. He writes without adornment, like someone who wants to leave a record before memory wears out. Later he will say that what impressed him most were not the bullets, but the spontaneous companionship, the sense of collective dignity that he had not seen in any other country. In April 1937, he receives an order to return to Barcelona. The city is no longer the same. The posters of revolutionary unity have been replaced by new slogans. Ideological discussions have become tense. The parties confront each other. The newspapers repeat rumors of treason. Orwell watches astonished the events of May: barricades, shots in the streets, militiamen fighting each other. That city that seemed an example of fraternity is now bleeding from within. From a window he observes how shots are exchanged between the Telefonica building and the groups that were previously allies. He understands that the war against fascism has diverted toward another battle, that of power within the own side. For days Barcelona lives in total chaos, then comes the imposed calm. The communists have taken political control and the POUM is accused of sabotage. Orwell, who belonged to that party, becomes a suspect. The same comrades who had shared trenches begin to be watched. He tries to return to the front, but the situation has changed. There are searches, arrests, blacklists. The atmosphere has become unbreathable. The Englishman understands that he is no longer in a war for the truth, but in a dispute over the narrative. What is written in the newspapers contradicts what he has seen. The same facts appear transformed, victims turned into traitors, betrayals turned into victories. That distance between the lived reality and the narrated one becomes his true obsession. When he manages to leave Spain, he carries with him something more valuable than the notebooks: the direct experience of how a revolution can devour itself with lies. In Paris, while waiting for the train to take him back to London, he flips through international newspapers. He reads chronicles that describe a Spain different from the one he knew. The articles speak of invented conspiracies, of heroisms that never occurred, of enemies that never existed. He realizes that the truth in times of war depends on the type of printing press that publishes it. Upon returning to England, he tries to tell what he saw. He sends manuscripts, writes articles, explains that propaganda is not only a tool of the fascists, but also a reflection of the human need to believe in a comfortable version of the world. Many do not want to listen to him, others accuse him of exaggerating, but he insists. What surprised him most in Spain was not the violence, it was the docility with which people accepted absurd versions. From that experience, the core of his book is born. Every line arises from the sensation of having seen a war where everyone believed they were defending reality, but each was fighting for their own narrative. The Republican and fascist press used the same language of certainty. The opposing sides agreed on something. Both needed the public to believe without questioning. In the last chapters of Homage to Catalonia, Orwell describes his escape from Spain. He crosses the border with his wife, tired and disillusioned. He carries a throat wounded by a bullet, clothes damp from the rain, and a conclusion that will accompany him the rest of his life. The truth is not destroyed with violence, it dissolves with consent. Animal Farm: How the Lie Became Relief. In his work Animal Farm, Orwell does not create just a political fable. He creates a mirror of human behavior in the face of the lie. He shows how people, in their animalized version, adapt quickly to an unjust order if that order saves them from thinking. Every scene he writes has the weight of a psychological observation. Tiredness, obedience, and the need for relief end up being more powerful than the desire for truth. From the first pages, the impulse of the animals is born from an authentic hope. They seek justice, they want to decide their destiny. But in that initial enthusiasm, something that Orwell considers universal is already hinted at. When a collective idea becomes difficult to maintain, the mind begins to seek comfortable refuges. The lie, in its most everyday form, does not appear as external deception, but as personal rest. The author captures it with precision. As the pigs take control of the farm, small distortions begin to appear. The changes are gradual, almost imperceptible. A word modified, a rule adjusted, an order explained with another intonation. Orwell shows how the most effective lie is not imposed, it is introduced gently. The animals accept those changes because they offer something valuable, the possibility of not questioning. In every chapter, Orwell portrays the way in which truth loses ground not through repression, but through lack of interest. No one needs coercion when the routine tires enough. The animals work, exhaust themselves, and prefer to delegate their thinking to those who claim to know more. The author lets it be seen that mental comfort is the root of self-deception. Thinking requires energy, and when that energy is scarce, the brain chooses to believe. Squealer, the pig who manages the discourse, is the voice of that process. His function is not only to lie, it is to maintain the emotional balance of the group. Every time something contradicts itself, he appears to offer an easy explanation, a kind phrase that relieves the discomfort. Orwell writes those scenes without drama. He presents them with an almost mechanical tone, as if he wanted the reader to notice how normal the absurd can become when it is repeated enough. That same mechanism appears embodied in another character. Throughout the book, Orwell insists on that point. Every time a character perceives something incoherent, instinct does not lead them to rebel, it leads them to correct themselves. Boxer, the tireless horse, is the perfect symbol of that behavior. His motto, "Work harder," is not blind obedience, it is self-justification. It represents the relief produced by turning doubt into physical effort. It is easier to keep ploughing than to accept that the ideal has been corrupted. The author shows how that process becomes routine. The official voice is repeated until it fills every space. The slogans are simplified so that no one has to analyze them. The sheep repeat phrases, the pigs adjust them, the others listen to them with relief. In that predictable noise, doubt becomes an unnecessary discomfort. Truth no longer disappears, it simply stops being sought. When the farm begins to distort its own laws, Orwell introduces a visual detail. The phrases on the wall change without witnesses. It is his way of pointing out that manipulation does not require open violence. It is enough that the others are too busy to look. Those erased and rewritten lines represent voluntary amnesia, the capacity to accept the new version because it is more comfortable than defending the old one. The writer makes it clear that deception prospers where people seek relief, not where there are strong tyrants. The pigs do not triumph through cunning, they triumph because the others prefer the emotional rest of believing them. In that logic, the lie does not hurt, it consoles. Truth, on the other hand, demands effort, and for that reason it becomes unpopular. The windmill, rebuilt time and again, symbolizes that persistent self-deception. Every collapse should wake doubts, but it only reinforces faith. Orwell shows how repeated failure can be transformed into proof of success when the mind decides not to endure more frustration. That reversal of meaning is what he considers the most dangerous point, the moment when the lie no longer needs to hide because it has been internalized as habit. From then on, the transformation no longer needs explanations. In the last pages, Orwell takes that comfort to its extreme. The pigs have already become indistinguishable from humans. The rest observe in silence, without anger, not because they do not understand it, but because understanding no longer serves them. The lie has stopped being a discourse, it has become an environment. Breathing it is more natural than trying to expel it. When words think for us. In Politics and the English Language, Orwell begins with a direct question. How can a society come to think poorly without realizing it? He does not pose it as theory, he poses it as observation. His starting point is language. He reviews the texts of his time with attention, seeking to understand how the way of speaking was deformed. In articles, speeches and letters, he finds the same pattern: long phrases, inflated words, sentences that seem firm but say nothing. Language, he explains, started to function on its own. No one chooses words anymore, words choose each other. And that automatic use repeated every day is emptying the heads of those who speak. Look at the examples. He finds worn-out metaphors that no longer evoke any image. Expressions like defeat the enemy on the battlefield of the economy or a fruitful brainstorm repeat sounds that no one listens to anymore. Writers copy them without thinking because they sound correct, and that sound correctness replaces meaning. In his essay, he notes that this way of writing is not an isolated error, but a mental habit. Writing without looking at what is said, like someone who signs papers without reading them. That habit, he says, is the beginning of intellectual deterioration. He reviews political writings and finds a pattern. Words get longer, verbs dissolve, actions disappear behind impersonal phrases. Where before it was said the army bombed the village, now it is written coercive measures were taken over the target area. The sentence changes, but also the consciousness. The first recognizes an act, the second disguises it. By changing the form, the degree of responsibility changes. Every euphemism is an anesthesia, every technical expression a bandage over the fact. Orwell does not point out the problem from nostalgia, but from observation. He collects real examples, reports, pamphlets, newspaper articles. He places them one next to another and shows that they all repeat the same structure of vagueness. He uses a precise image. Political phrases are like inflated pillows. They seem large, but inside there is nothing. What worries him is not the clumsiness of the one who writes them, but the ease with which the public accepts them. A lazy language does not need censorship, it self-regulates by inertia. Mediocrity spreads without resistance. The essay advances with a meticulous dissection. Orwell shows how certain words become a refuge for those who do not want to think. They are terms that sound elevated: progress, democracy, freedom, spiritual values, moral imperative. Each one seems noble, but none has a stable meaning. They function as wrappers. They can serve to justify any action or its opposite. The power of these words does not reside in their content, but in their ambiguity. They are linguistic amulets. By pronouncing them, the speaker feels protected. The problem, Orwell explains, is not in the words themselves, but in the mind that uses them without precision. A politician repeats defense of freedom, and the listener nods without asking what freedom he is talking about. That automatic acceptance is the point where language separates from reality. From then on, phrases no longer describe the world, they substitute it. Language, which should be a bridge, becomes a wall. People no longer discuss facts, they discuss words. And when words lose their anchor, collective thought sinks into a kind of reasonable fog. To show to what extent language can deform clarity, Orwell constructs a deliberately absurd example. He takes a passage from the Bible, brief, direct, clear, and rewrites it with the bureaucratic style of his time. The result is grotesque. Where before there was rhythm and sense, now there is redundancy and emptiness. The exercise reveals something profound. Modern prose has lost contact with sensory reality. Words float, they no longer touch the things they name. Language becomes a cloud that covers everything and touches nothing. That shift is not accidental. At the heart of the essay, Orwell launches his diagnosis. The English language, and by extension any language, deteriorates when those who use it stop caring about its meaning. It is a reciprocal process. Mental laziness generates decadent language, and that decadent language reinforces mental laziness. It is a closed circle. The more vague a word is, the easier it is to think in a vague way. The more clumsy the phrase, the more clumsy the thought. The mind and the tongue contaminate each other until the confusion seems natural. Throughout the text, Orwell offers 6 rules to break that cycle. They are simple, but they demand consciousness. He asks to avoid inherited metaphors, prefer short words, eliminate unnecessary foreign terms, choose the active voice, delete useless phrases, and above all, ask oneself if each sentence expresses exactly what one wants to say. Behind that simplicity, there is a philosophy. Clarity is not a stylistic luxury, it is a form of integrity. Whoever writes with precision thinks with precision, and whoever thinks with precision is harder to deceive. In his last part, Orwell insists on individual responsibility. No one can clean another's language, but each person can take care of their own. That daily vigilance, he says, is an act of freedom. Thinking before speaking is not an exercise in style, it is a form of resistance. Whoever forces themselves to find the right word recovers their inner autonomy. It is not an easy task, because the environment pushes one to speak like everyone else. But language, used with attention, can once again be what it always should have been, a faithful mirror of thought. The text ends with a warning that crosses the century. Words are deformed slowly, without noise, without coups. They become comfortable, soft, painless, and when everything sounds the same, no one distinguishes truth from the echo. Orwell does not ask for linguistic purity, he asks for lucidity. In a world saturated with discourses, clarity becomes an act of courage. Writing well, thinking well, speaking with precision. Those are the last refuges of truth before language becomes its enemy. The fear that writes for us. What most caught Orwell's attention was not a war nor a speech. It was a simple meeting of writers. In The Prevention of Literature, he recalls that encounter in London, organized to commemorate Milton. What should have been a celebration of the free word ended up showing its disappearance. While listening to the attendees, he noticed that every time someone said freedom, the air became thick. Glances met, voices lowered, and everyone seemed to measure what they were saying. There were no censors present, but fear was already working on its own. There he understood that self-censorship does not need orders, only habit. From that observation, the essay becomes an X-ray of domesticated thought. Orwell warns that danger does not come from the state censor, but from the writer who adjusts to the political climate before being monitored. He calls it the prevention of literature, and he does not mean burning books, but preventing someone from having the courage to write them. It is an invisible disease that starts with precaution and ends in intellectual servitude. The lie no longer needs orders. The foresight of fear is enough. He analyzes how that mental docility extends among journalists, essayists, and editors. Each one measures the consequences of what they write, calculates the impact, filters their own words. It is not direct repression, it is voluntary adaptation. The journalist avoids uncomfortable topics. The academic uses neutral terms. The novelist erases conflicting passages so as not to lose their contract. Everyone acts before someone tells them what they should keep quiet about. That reflex of self-control, Orwell points out, is the deepest triumph of modern domination. No one prohibits anything, but everyone keeps quiet about the same thing. In the center of the text, Orwell describes how truth begins to be negotiated. In newsrooms and publishing houses, certain ideas become unpresentable. They are not rejected openly, they are silenced with gestures, with omissions, with excuses. Censorship no longer uses red ink, it uses courtesy. Words are softened, facts are rounded off. One writes so as not to annoy, so as not to be left out of the group. And so, Orwell says, an invisible border is raised between what is thought and what can be said. It is the most effective border because the writer himself guards it from within. The essay advances on a question that he himself formulates with irony. How can literature survive in a world where telling the truth has become a rarity? For him, literature is born from the impulse to say what is seen, even when it is uncomfortable. But that impulse is in danger because contemporary thought has filled up with ideological traps. In Western democracies, he comments, censorship no longer presents itself as prohibition, but as loyalty. Alignment with the just cause is requested. The result is the same as in a dictatorship. Dissident voices disappear, even though no one has directly silenced them. Orwell observes that many British intellectuals of his time prefer to justify the lies of Allied regimes while condemning those of their enemies. That double standard is disguised as political commitment. Speaking clearly is considered treason. Keeping quiet is considered common sense. The most educated become the most cautious. The whole culture reorganizes itself around the fear of saying the obvious. The fear of sincerity, he writes, has replaced the love for precision. Literature, by losing its independence, becomes decorated propaganda. As the essay progresses, Orwell's tone becomes more clinical. He examines the factors that foster that silence: political pressure, social comfort, economic dependence. He points out that the modern writer no longer lives isolated. He lives entangled in institutions, publishing houses, foundations, magazines. On them depends his reputation, his salary, his audience. And in that environment, independence costs too much. The one who insists on saying what they think is labeled as problematic. The rest learn to be reasonable, and reason used as a shield becomes an alibi. Orwell does not accuse the victims. He understands that self-censorship is born from fear, but he insists that it is also a choice. In his analysis, the writer who keeps quiet does so out of prudence, but also out of a desire for security. There is pleasure in being accepted, in belonging, in not risking. That satisfaction is what, according to him, destroys literature before the police arrive. The freedom to write, he says, is an inner attitude before an external right. When that attitude disappears, censorship does not have to do anything. In one part of the essay, Orwell stops at a revealing contrast. While in totalitarian regimes, repression is visible, in free societies it is silent. In a country where the press is controlled, people know that there is censorship. In a country where the press self-corrects, the illusion of freedom is kept intact. It is the most dangerous form of control. Everyone believes they are free while they watch each other. Public language is filled with careful phrases, discussions become sterile, literature accommodates itself to the limits that it itself has accepted. Toward the end, Orwell reflects on what he calls the climate of intellectual distrust. In an environment where honesty is perceived as provocation, free literature becomes improbable. The lie stops being an isolated fact and becomes atmosphere. Writers no longer fear censorship, they fear isolation, and so true ideas die before being said. The danger, Orwell says, is not in the lack of geniuses, but in the abundance of cowards. When prudence becomes a virtue, thought stagnates. He closes his essay with an idea that connects it with all his subsequent work. Freedom of expression does not maintain itself, it feeds on the courage of those who exercise it. The first defeat occurs in the interior of the writer, at the moment in which he decides to keep quiet to preserve his place. That resignation, repeated millions of times, produces a society where the lie is imposed without effort. Orwell formulates it with a cold clarity. Literature dies when the truth becomes unpronounceable. Censorship is not needed when everyone has learned to keep quiet in time. 1984, the triumph of the perfect lie. Orwell takes his observation to the most extreme point. It is no longer about the lie as a strategy or as a mental relief. In his book 1984, falsehood becomes the very way of existing. The citizen no longer acts under deception, he lives within it. The party does not need to convince because the official narrative feels natural. The distortion does not operate from the outside, but from within thought. The protagonist, Winston Smith, lives in a society where the past changes every day. His job consists of modifying old files so they coincide with present versions. Figures, names, speeches, everything is adjusted to the current narrative. No one orders him directly, but he does it out of routine. He does it like one breathes. In that constant repetition, Orwell shows the final mutation of the human being subjected to a perpetual lie. Thought adapts to change, memory becomes obedient, reality loses thickness. The world of 1984 is made of total surveillance, but what interests Orwell most are not the cameras or the punishments. It is acceptance. Surveillance works because the surveyed internalize it. In every face, an expression of agreement is installed, in every word, a dose of calculation. Winston perceives it in his office colleagues. Everyone repeats the party slogans with a mixture of faith and tiredness. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. They are phrases that, by being repeated, stop being contradictory. They become natural. Language no longer communicates, it creates reality. In that context, even resistance becomes fragile. Winston tries to resist. He writes in a diary, seeks to remember. In that tiny act, Orwell shows the last attempt to think without permission. 1984, the triumph of the perfect lie. Orwell takes his observation to the most extreme point. It is no longer about the lie as a strategy or as a mental relief. In his book 1984, falsehood becomes the very way of existing. The citizen no longer acts under deception, he lives within it. The party does not need to convince because the official narrative feels natural. The distortion does not operate from the outside, but from within thought. The protagonist, Winston Smith, lives in a society where the past changes every day. His job consists of modifying old files so they coincide with present versions. Figures, names, speeches, everything is adjusted to the current narrative. No one orders him directly, but he does it out of routine. He does it like one breathes. In that constant repetition, Orwell shows the final mutation of the human being subjected to a perpetual lie. Thought adapts to change, memory becomes obedient, reality loses thickness. The world of 1984 is made of total surveillance, but what interests Orwell most are not the cameras or the punishments. It is acceptance. Surveillance works because the surveyed internalize it. In every face, an expression of agreement is installed, in every word, a dose of calculation. Winston perceives it in his office colleagues. Everyone repeats the party slogans with a mixture of faith and tiredness. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. They are phrases that, by being repeated, stop being contradictory. They become natural. Language no longer communicates, it creates reality. In that context, even resistance becomes fragile. Winston tries to resist. He writes in a diary, seeks to remember. In that tiny act, Orwell shows the last attempt to think without permission. But even that private gesture feels foreign, dangerous, almost absurd. Fear no longer comes from the outside, it lives in the conscience. Every word that Winston notes down seems to betray something inside him. The official lie does not only surround him, it contains him. As the story progresses, the character understands that truth has not been defeated by violence, but by habit. The party has achieved something that no previous tyranny had reached, controlling the internal logic of thought. It does not limit itself to prohibiting opinions, it redefines facts. If the party says that 2 + 2 are 5, the citizen must believe it, and believe it not as a political act, but as a vital reflex. The most effective control is the one that turns falsehood into a sensation of reality. When that occurs, truth stops having a function. The lie does not need to impose itself because it no longer has a rival. In the corridors of the Ministry of Truth, Winston sees how documents are rewritten over and over again. History changes every day, but no one feels cheated. The employees destroy the previous files with bureaucratic diligence. The pages fall into the pneumatic tube that leads to the incinerator. The smoke of burned facts blends with the air of the city. Orwell describes that scene as a modern ritual, the collective faith that the present is always right. Reality stops being what happened, it is what is said to have happened. The power of the party is not based only on force, but on its capacity to define truth from the interior of consciences. Doublethink. That mechanism that allows holding two opposite ideas without perceiving the contradiction is the heart of the system. The citizen believes and disbelieves at the same time. He remembers and forgets according to the convenience of the moment. Thought fragments until there is no longer a difference between believing and pretending. Orwell formulates it with precision. The triumph of the party consists of making falsehood be sincerity. In the figure of O'Brien, the official who guides and destroys Winston, Orwell concentrates the logic of that domination. O'Brien does not seek to deceive, he seeks to transform. He tells Winston that truth does not exist outside of power. What the party declares true becomes reality. In that dialogue, the author takes his argument to the essence of totalitarianism, the control of the being through the control of thought. It is not that people lie, but that they can no longer conceive of another way of thinking that is not the collective lie. During the interrogation, O'Brien demonstrates that logic can be used as an instrument of subjection. He does not try to convince Winston. He trains him. He forces him to renounce the idea of an independent truth. Each question destroys a layer of his reason. Each answer pushes him toward a deeper mental obedience. In that process, the lie stops being external. It becomes a reflex, a sensation of security. Winston ends up accepting what he is ordered to believe, not out of fear, but out of a need for inner coherence. The culminating scene occurs when O'Brien confronts him with the definitive question, does reality exist outside of us? Winston hesitates. He tries to affirm that yes, that facts exist even if no one sees them. But his resistance falls apart. O'Brien smiles and teaches him the final version of power. Collective thought creates truth. The party does not only control what people say, it controls what people perceive. At that moment, the lie reaches its purest form. It is no longer discourse, it is identity. Orwell builds the outcome with symbolic precision. Winston, broken, repeats the party slogans without effort. He no longer pretends, he believes. The false became habit. In his final texts, gathered in essays, journalism and letters from 1945 to 1950, George Orwell observes the years after the war with a mixture of lucidity and tiredness. He has seen empires fall, flags change, and the same lies repeat under other names. From his desk, he describes a habit that spreads like dust over the streets. People learn to live among half-truths. It is not about great conspiracies, but about an invisible education. Day after day, falsehood becomes a landscape. No one imposes it, everyone absorbs it. With the passing of time, that habit starts to be noticed in the everyday. In his articles, Orwell details how it installs itself in the smallest gestures. Conversation is filled with measured phrases. Prudence replaces frankness. Words are chosen not to say, but to survive. In the cafes of London and in the newsrooms he frequents, he notes that men speak with a new caution. Every opinion seeks not to seem extremist. Every silence carries a calculation. It is the modern normalcy, pretending balance while renouncing thinking clearly. But the phenomenon does not stop there. That climate is not limited to politics or war. Among his late essays, there is one where he reflects on journalism as a spectacle. He speaks of the growing taste for headlines that entertain and distract, of the public that demands emotion before truth. The reader wants to feel, not to understand. In that tendency, he sees a mutation of the spirit. The lie stops being a communicative error to become an emotional necessity. The citizen seeks the narrative that suits him. Truth, with its harshness, remains relegated to the margins. Orwell notes it without drama. The lie has become a public service. Toward the end of that journey, Orwell no longer writes from indignation, but from observation. He speaks of the fatigue of truth, a condition that affects both the powerful and the common. Everyone knows that things are not as they are said to be, but continuing to pretend is easier than remaking the world. The lie becomes emotional economy. Repeating what is accepted saves energy. Pretending agreement avoids the effort of thinking. It is a silent pact that maintains the superficial peace of day to day. In one of his briefest notes, he writes that modern man does not seek truth or lie, he seeks comfort. That phrase summarizes his deepest observation. The problem is not state propaganda or empty speeches. It is the human habit of adjusting conscience in order to live in peace. That adaptation, which starts through fear and ends through habit, transforms falsehood into breathable air. It is accepted without thinking because everyone else also accepts it, and when everyone does it, it stops seeming like a lie.